The invitation said black tie optional. Jolene had written that herself, which was the first sign she'd never intended for Wren to come at all. The second sign was the look on Jolene's face when Wren walked through the doors of the Hargrove ballroom. That particular kind of smile that wasn't really a smile, the one that started at the corners of the mouth and stopped before it reached the eyes. The kind that said, "Oh, you actually showed up. You wore that," Jolene said. Not a question, a verdict. Wren looked down at her dress, navy blue. She'd paid 42 for it at the consignment store on Mercer Street, and she'd thought, genuinely thought, that it was fine, that it was enough. She'd ironed it twice and fixed the loose button on the left shoulder seam herself with a needle and thread at 11 o'clock the night before. "It's a dress," Wren said. "It's a tablecloth," Jolene said, and laughed, and the two women standing beside her, both in things that probably cost more than Wren's monthly rent, laughed with her, right on cue, the way people do when they've been laughing at the same things for so long they don't even need to hear the joke anymore. Wren didn't move. She'd learned a long time ago that moving when someone wanted you to move was a kind of surrender. The Hargrove ballroom was the kind of room that made you feel the specific weight of everything you weren't. Crystal chandeliers, the real kind, not the knockoffs they used at the convention center downtown. Marble floors that had probably been imported from somewhere with a name she couldn't pronounce. Round tables draped in white linen, gold-rimmed china. Flowers that hadn't been touched by anything as graceless as a grocery store. Her father's 75th birthday party. His idea, apparently. Or rather Jolene's idea, presented to him as his own, which was how most of the last 12 years of his life had worked. Wren's father stood at the far end of the room near the bar, looking smaller than she remembered. He'd shrunk since she'd last seen him. Not just in the physical sense, though that too, but in the way a person shrinks when they've spent too many years being managed by someone who does it quietly enough that they never noticed. He caught her eye across the room and gave her a small, tight nod. Not "come here," not "I'm glad you came." Just acknowledgement. She existed. He'd registered it. That was about as warm as it got, with him. She hadn't been going to come. She'd decided 3 separate times in the past 2 weeks that she wasn't going to come, had even drafted a text twice. "Sorry, work, can't make it," and deleted it both times because some old, stupid part of her kept hoping that this time it would be different, that her father would see her standing in a room and feel something that looked like pride, or at least something that didn't look like relief that she'd stayed in the background, where Jolene preferred her. Jolene was her half-sister, her father's daughter from his second marriage, the one that had lasted, the one that had given him the family that fit the frame he'd always had in his head. Jolene was 41 and looked 30, and spent money with the casual fluency of someone who'd never once had to do math in a grocery store aisle. Wren was 31 and looked tired and could do grocery store math in her head faster than most people could reach for their phones. She found a spot near the back wall, beside one of the flower arrangements, and she stood there with a glass of water because the bartender had looked at her and threw her in the same glance, and she hadn't felt like pushing it. The room filled. Her father held court. Jolene moved through it like she'd choreographed the whole evening in advance, which she probably had, touching elbows and laughing at the right moments, and steering people away from the corners where the conversation might drift somewhere inconvenient. Wren watched. She was good at watching. It was one of the things she'd gotten good at over the years. Sitting with a spreadsheet, or a ledger, or a set of accounts receivable, and just watching the numbers until the patterns surfaced, until the thing that didn't belong became obvious. She'd been doing forensic accounting for 6 years. She'd started because it was the only entry-level position at Delacroix and Associates that hadn't required a reference, and she'd stayed because she turned out to be very, very good at finding the thing that didn't belong. The pattern here was Jolene. But she'd known that for years. She was thinking about leaving, genuinely calculating the least visible path to the exit, when the doors opened again. She didn't look, at first. More guests arriving was not her business. But the room changed when the doors opened. The temperature of it changed. The noise didn't stop exactly, but it shifted, went sideways, the way a flock of birds will all turn at once. It's before you've registered the thing that spooked them. She looked. There were 4 of them, 3 in the back, positioned in that particular way that meant they were working, not attending. The one in front walked like a man who had spent a long time deciding that he was not going to explain himself to anyone, and had arrived at that decision so thoroughly that his body had simply arranged itself accordingly. Tall, not in a conspicuous way, but in the way that meant the room realigned around him without anyone acknowledging it. Dark suit, not new, or rather, not ostentatious. The kind of expensive that didn't need to announce itself. His face was, she found herself doing the thing she did with spreadsheets, cataloguing details before she'd decided to. Angular. Tired around the eyes, a scar along the left jaw that hadn't been covered or explained away. Mid-40s, maybe. He moved like someone whose knees had taken damage, but who'd decided that was not information he was going to share with anyone. He stood inside the doors and looked at the room the way she did, taking inventory. His gaze stopped on her. Not near her. Not past her. On her. She looked behind herself. There was a wall. She looked back. He was still looking. She picked up her water glass and looked somewhere else, because whatever that was, it wasn't for her, and she'd learned that the hard way enough times that the lesson had fully calcified by now. Jolene materialized from somewhere, which was impressive because she'd been across the room less than 30 seconds ago. That was another thing Jolene was good at, moving toward power before it had finished announcing itself. "Mr. Fenn," Jolene said, and her voice had gone to a different register, the one she used when she wanted something. "I'm so glad you could come. I wasn't sure you'd—" "I had a reason to," the man said. Fenn. His voice was low, the kind of low that didn't require any additional volume to be heard. He wasn't looking at Jolene. He was still looking at Wren. Jolene followed his gaze. The smile she turned on Wren was the best one she had. The one that could have been mistaken for warmth if you didn't know her, the one that worked on people who hadn't spent 31 years watching it get deployed. "That's just my sister," Jolene said. She managed to make it sound like an apology for a mess that had been left out by accident. She got a little turned around with the dress code. "What's her name?" Fenn said. Still not a question. A different kind of sentence entirely. Jolene blinked. In all the years Wren had been watching her half-sister operate, she'd never seen her genuinely pause before. Her name is Wren. She does bookkeeping, somewhere downtown. Forensic accounting, Wren said, before she'd finished deciding to say it. Both of them looked at her. Fenn's mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it. "There's a difference," she said. He started walking toward her. Not toward the bar, not toward her father, not toward the arrangement of important-looking men that had gathered near the windows. Toward her. The room moved around him the same way it had when he'd walked in, that involuntary realignment, and she had to work to keep her face neutral, because there was a difference between her not moving when someone wanted her to move and her standing still because she'd forgotten how to do anything else. He stopped in front of her, closer than was socially necessary. Not close enough to be inappropriate, just close enough to require a decision. "Wren," he said, and it sounded less like an introduction and more like he'd just put something down on a table and was deciding whether to pick it up again. "Mr. Fenn," she said. "Lorcan," he said. "I'll call you Fenn," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalculating something. "Why? Because you walked in here like everyone already knows who you are, and I'd rather not give you the satisfaction of confirming it." The pause that followed was long enough that she had time to register that she'd probably said something she shouldn't have, and that she wasn't, she noticed, particularly sorry about it. "Fair," he said. He didn't stay by her side. That would have been a different kind of story. What he did was circulate through the room, and every time she tracked his position, which she did with the same involuntary precision she used to track anomalies in a data set, he was angled in a way that kept her in his peripheral vision. She didn't know what to do with that, so she filed it and moved on. Her father found her around 9 o'clock, which meant it had taken him 2.5 hours to cross a room that was maybe 40 feet across. She was almost impressed. "You came," he said. "You invited me." Jolene sent the invitations. "I know," Wren said. Gerald Calloway. Because that was who her father was, a man who'd always been just slightly out of focus in her own memories, soft around the edges in a way that had nothing to do with fondness. Looked at the floor for a moment. He had the look of a man who'd had something he needed to say, and had been putting it off for a length of time that had now become embarrassing to acknowledge. "There's some trouble," he said finally. "With the business." She waited. "The accounts. The ones Jolene handles. I've thought for a while." He stopped. "Tried again. Someone's been moving money, small amounts, for a long time. I can't prove it. Have you looked at the ledgers?" "I've tried." He shook his head. "I can't see it. I know something's wrong. I can feel it, but I can't see where." Wren looked at him for a moment. At the thin line of his shoulders, the way his hands sat in his pockets. He'd always done that. Asked for things without quite asking, approached need with such oblique casualness that you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. She was paying attention. "Send me what you have," she said. "I'll look." His relief was immediate and uncomfortable. "I wasn't sure you'd." "I'll look," she said again. "Send me the files." He nodded, and then someone called him away, and that was it. That was what 31 years reduced to, sometimes. A 5-minute conversation and a data transfer request. She turned back to the wall and found Fenn standing 6 feet away. She had not heard him approach. She did not know how a man of that size moved without making any sound, but she filed that under. Things about him that were going to be a problem. "Your father's in debt," Fenn said. It wasn't a question. It also wasn't an accusation. It was the tone of someone reading a balance sheet aloud. "I don't know your business with my father," she said. "And I'm not going to guess. Smart. Not really, just disciplined." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the party continued. Glasses clinking, laughter that had been going on long enough to sound a little frantic at the edges, the particular exhaustion of a room full of people performing ease. "He owes me $400,000, Fenn said. "He's owed it for 8 months. The collateral he offered isn't worth half what he said it was." She kept her face very still. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the one he should have sent to negotiate in the first place." She looked at him. He looked at her. Across the room, Jolene had positioned herself near the windows with a group of people and was laughing the kind of laugh that meant she was working. And something about the angle of her sister's posture, the calculation in it, made something cold settle at the base of Wren's spine. "There's a pattern," she said, before she'd decided to say it, "in how the collateral was valued. I don't have the ledgers yet, but I'd put money on it being deliberate." Fenn's expression didn't change, but he said, "So would I." She went home that night with 3 things: her father's forwarded files, a business card that said "Only L," Fenn, and a phone number in raised black type, and a feeling she couldn't quite categorize, which was inconvenient because she was very good at categorizing things. She sat at her kitchen table at 1:30 in the morning with her laptop and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and she opened the files. The ledgers were a mess. Not an accidental mess. She knew the difference, and this wasn't it. This was the specific kind of mess that came from someone who understood numbers just well enough to know how to hide things in them. Small transfers, always below threshold. Recurring entries labeled with codes that looked standard until you noticed they appeared in no accounting framework she'd ever been trained on. A vendor that showed up in the payables for 3 years, and when she ran the registration number, resolved to a holding company, that resolved to another holding company, that resolved to a residential address in Clearwater, Florida, registered to a woman named Jolene Calloway Marsh. Wren sat back in her chair. She'd known. She'd suspected. But knowing and finding the numbers were 2 different things, and right now she had the numbers. She picked up the business card. Put it down, picked it up again. It was almost to the number anyway, because she'd never been good at sitting on things that needed to be resolved. "This is Wren Calloway. I found something in the ledgers. It's worse than your 400,000. The reply came in 40 seconds. "Where are you?" She stared at that for a moment. Not what did you find, or can this wait until morning? Just, where are you? She sent her address. 15 minutes later, there was a knock at her door. She opened it, and Fenn stood in her doorway in the same suit, minus the jacket, with an expression on his face that looked like he'd already done the math and was waiting for her to catch up. You didn't have to come in person, she said. I wanted to see the files. She stepped back and let him in. He was too large for her apartment. Not physically. He fit through the doorway without incident, but in the way that a person who takes up a specific kind of space takes it up everywhere, and her apartment was the kind of small where every object was in a specific place for a specific reason, and there wasn't room for additional weight. He sat at her kitchen table without being invited to, which should have bothered her more than it did. She sat across from him and turned the laptop so he could see the screen. Here, she said, the vendor code, and here, same code, different format, 7 months apart. They changed the label but kept the structure. Whoever set this up knows accounting well enough to be dangerous, but not well enough to be clean about it. He looked at the screen. His face in the light of the laptop was different than it had been in the ballroom. Less composed, or rather composed differently, the way a person looks when they've dropped the version of themselves they wear in public and haven't put on the private one yet. How long? He said. Conservative estimate, 4 years. Could be longer if the earlier records were cleaned. He was quiet for a moment. Your father didn't know. He suspected something. He didn't know what. And Jolene? Wren looked at the screen. Jolene set it up. The silence that followed had a specific texture to it. She'd been in rooms where information landed wrong before. She did fraud work, that was most of what she did, and she'd learned to recognize the moment when a person had to decide whether to be angry or strategic. Fenn made that decision very fast. Faster than most. What do you want? He said. She frowned. What? For this? He gestured at the laptop. You came to the party. You looked at the files on a Friday night. You texted me at 2 in the morning. You want something. She didn't answer immediately. It would have been easier to be offended, but he wasn't wrong to ask, and she'd spent too long around people who never asked because they assumed they already knew to waste energy on being offended by someone who at least had the directness to say it out loud. My father's debt, she said. Cleared. Whatever Jolene took from you, that comes out of her, not him. He's 75 years old and she's been running this on him for 4 years without him knowing. Fenn looked at her for a long moment. That's it. That's it. Not money. Not a favor. Just him. He's my father, she said, and it came out flat because she was trying very hard not to let any of the other things underneath that sentence come through with it. He's not a good one, but he's the one I've got. Something in Fenn's expression shifted. It was a small thing, nothing as obvious as softening, nothing as neat as understanding. More like a door that had been closed moved slightly without opening. You'll need to document everything, he said. I know, and you'll need to be willing to testify to what you found, in a proceeding that won't be a courtroom. She'd understood that from the moment she'd opened the files. I know, she said again. It'll put you in proximity to things you probably want distance from. Mr. Fenn, she said, and he looked at her. I found a fraud. I document frauds. The nature of who committed it doesn't change what it is. He studied her face. She let him, because she had nothing to hide from him that she hadn't already said out loud. Lorcan, he said. She shook her head. Not yet. His mouth did the not quite smile again. When? When you've earned it, she said. People who come to my apartment at 2 in the morning because I texted them a number they gave me an hour ago don't automatically get first-name privileges. Most people don't say no to me, he said. Most people you deal with owe you something, she said. I don't. Not yet. Not yet hung in the air between them. She hadn't meant to say the second part. He looked at it. She could tell from the quality of his silence that he'd heard it. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked back at the screen. Walk me through the vendor codes again, he said. She pulled the laptop back around. Here's the first instance. No, he said. Start from the beginning. I want to understand how you saw it. Something in her chest did an inconvenient thing that she chose not to name. Okay, she said. From the beginning. She talked, and he listened, and outside her window the city made its usual indifferent noise, and at some point she made a second cup of coffee, and he accepted half without being asked, and the numbers that had looked like chaos at 10 o'clock became, slowly, under the overhead kitchen light, a shape she could see all the way around. He left at 4:30 in the morning. She walked him. He stopped in the doorway, that same threshold where he'd stood 2.5 hours ago, except now he had a copy of everything on a drive she'd prepared, and the shape of things had shifted in some way she couldn't entirely quantify. "I'll be in touch," he said. "I assumed," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not the inventory look from the ballroom, not the calculating look from the kitchen table. Something else she didn't have a name for yet. The dress, he said, was fine. She blinked. He was already walking down the hallway. She closed the door and leaned against it for a moment in the dark of her apartment, and she thought about spreadsheets and scar tissue and the way a person's voice sounds when they're not performing for anyone. And she thought, "You are in a significant amount of trouble, Wren Calloway." She went back to the kitchen table, opened the next file. She had work to do, and Fenn had her numbers now, which meant she had to be faster than whatever came next. She always worked better under pressure. She always had.